の道は一本の綱の上を通っているのだが、綱が張られているのは高いところではなく、地面すれすれである。それは歩かせるためというよりむしろ、つまずかせるためのもののように見える。
A Country Doctor by Franz Kafka. I was in great perplexity. I had to start on an urgent journey. A seriously ill patient was waiting for me in a village 10 miles off. A thick blizzard of snow filled all the wide spaces between him and me. I had a gig, a light gig with big wheels.
The writing of Franz Kafka is so unique and ineffable to some that an entire word has been invented just to describe it: Kafkaesque. As you might have guessed, Kafkaesque describes works or ideas relating to or resembling the literary work of Franz Kafka. These works are characterized by a complexity that seems senseless, surreal, or menacing. Kafka's fiction takes us into worlds both familiar and grotesquely unfamiliar, where the rules of reality as we understand them don't always apply, and yet they feel strangely universal. Who hasn't, on a bad day, identified with the pathetic isolation of Gregor Samsa in Metamorphosis? In A Country Doctor, Kafka captures with urgent precision the utter absurdity and panicked dread of a bad dream in a mere 2,500 words. But is that all there is to this story? Or is Kafka mocking our confusion from beyond the grave? On a cold winter night, a country doctor prepares to depart from his estate to tend to the needs of a sick patient 10 miles away. Unfortunately, he is in need of a horse for his carriage, referred to as a trap, but his own steed has perished one night earlier. As the doctor kicks open the door to his pigsty, a mysterious groom appears and supplies him with a pair of horses and secures them to the carriage. The groom aggressively kisses the doctor's maid, and while the doctor wishes to chastise him, he feels that he cannot, as he is in the man's debt. As he departs in the carriage, the maid flees inside the doctor's house, with the groom in close pursuit. The doctor wishes to help her, but he is powerless as the horses travel instantaneously to their intended destination. Once at his patient's house, the doctor attempts to treat his patient, a bedridden young boy who doesn't appear to have any sort of ailment. Nevertheless, the patient implores that the doctor let him die. The doctor then notices that the patient has a horrid, bloody infection on his side, which is beset by multi-legged worms. The boy then begs to be saved. As his kin assemble around the doctor to see him work, the horses from outside have stuck their heads into the windows of the room. The family sings a bizarre, quasi-religious verse as the doctor works. Then they proceed to strip him naked and lay him in bed next to his patient, under the apparent impression that this will cure him. The doctor assures his patient that his wound is not lethal and promptly leaves the room, grabbing his clothes and instruments as he does. He does not bother getting dressed and promptly throws his belongings into the carriage, but the horses are weary and only trudge through the snow instead. The doctor then despairs at his prospects of returning home at the rate the horses are now moving, and he thinks briefly of his maid's impending rape, that his practice will be lost, though he considers himself irreplaceable, and the fact that his fur coat now dangles out of reach at the far end of his carriage while he is still naked in the cold. He feels betrayed that none of his patients will help him. Kafka's style is best described as literary modernism, which is a movement characterized by a conscious break with the pretenses of traditional narrative and verse styles with the aim of expressing the sensibilities of the current age. Linguistic despair seems to permeate this story, as does despair of all the false assurances in the doctor's world, to which his society clings to with a desperate determination. During any time of doubt and impending social upheaval, there is much uncertainty over traditional values and institutions. Like the hapless doctor, Kafka may have viewed his own role as a writer to be a wrongly esteemed one. We think highly of the artists who have enriched our lives and supplied us with entertainment, but sometimes we place our idols on impossible pedestals where they are charged with tasks they cannot hope to fulfill. Writers like to think of their work as important, but who wants to be saddled with the expectation of changing the world? The doctor wishes to help his community, but he cannot. He cannot even help his own maid fend off the advances of the groom or control his horses in any meaningful way. It is no accident that the world Kafka presents here is a spiritually barren one. The boy asks the doctor in a pointed double entendre, "Will you save me?" The doctor then muses, "This is typical of the people in my district, always asking the impossible of the doctor. They have lost their old faith. The minister sits at home and picks apart his vestments, one by one, but the doctor is expected to fix everything with his fine surgical hand." The boy's family hardly seems to understand what the doctor can or should be able to do for his patient, and regards the visit as a mystical, ritualistic event. Powerless to help his patient, the doctor nonetheless provides him with a false assurance before he leaves, but colored water is surely no cure for a real ailment. This is rather bluntly stated at the end. A false ring of the night bell, once answered, it can never be made right. Naked and astray in the night, the doctor sees his fur coat trailing in the snow from where it caught on the carriage, but he is unable to reach it. Thus, this symbol of the warmth and security the doctor cannot have for himself or provide for the people in his community is the final image Kafka imparts to us. Though a country doctor, a story in which Kafka captures with urgent precision the utter absurdity and panicked dread of a bad dream, defies any easy attempt at distilling direct sociological allegory, its uncharted realms address a collective consciousness in humanity which, at its core, is fundamentally sick and incurable. Hence the patient's first request be to the doctor to let him die. It's definitely part of the tradition of literary modernism, which is a movement characterized by a conscious break with the pretenses of traditional narrative and verse styles, with the aim of expressing the sensibilities of the current age. In this story, as in all of his fiction, Kafka has allowed us a peek into desperate dimensions of the human soul that are not only beyond reason, but beyond language to capture, even for those of us who would like to help. The story is rich with symbols, such as the fur coat trailing off the back of the doctor's carriage, representing warmth and security, being just out of reach during an impossibly slow journey while naked and alone.
James Joyce's Dubliners was published in 1914, and it was his first major work of fiction. He'd put out a book of poems a few years earlier. This collection of 15 short stories is important for several reasons. For one thing, it shows us how Joyce, who went on to write innovative and complex modernist texts like Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, got his start writing simpler tales with more conventional prose. It's also notable as a portrait of middle and working-class life in Ireland during a complicated period when the country was struggling towards independence from England and its citizens were searching for a uniquely Irish identity. If you take a close look at the protagonists in each of these stories, you'll notice an interesting pattern. The first stories are all about children, and as the book progresses, it moves on to stories about young people and adults, finally ending with a middle-aged man looking back over his life in the last story, The Dead. In a neat literary trick, the book progresses the way human life progresses. In The Sisters, a young boy and his aunt visit two sisters who are keeping watch over the body of their brother, a priest. In An Encounter, two boys skip classes and gallivant around Dublin, till a meeting with a strangely lecherous old man frightens the narrator into retreat. In the next story, Araby, a bazaar called Araby, provides the opportunity for a young boy to purchase a gift for his crush, the sister of a friend. However, he returns empty-handed. In Eveline, the title character has to make a decision. Should she elope with her sweetheart to Argentina? At the critical moment, she abandons the plan. In After the Race, a young student tries to keep up with appearances but foolishly spends all his money at the racetrack. In Two Gallants, Two down-on-their-luck drifters, Corley and Lenehan, plot to swindle a maid who works in a fancy house. In the boarding house, Mrs. Mooney urges things along towards a marriage proposal when she sees sparks between her daughter Polly and one of her tenants. In A Little Cloud, dinner with an old friend provokes little Chandler to rethink his own life, including his failed ambitions as a writer and his sparkless marriage. In Counterparts, the frustrated alcoholic Farrington behaves violently in the pub and then goes home and beats his son. In Clay, the hardworking Maria goes to visit Joe and his family. She remembers how she used to take care of Joe when he was little. In A Painful Case, Mr. Duffy has feelings for Miss Sinico, but his prudishness causes him to end the affair. 4 years later, he learns that she has died and is filled with regret. In Ivy Day in the Commitment Room, Ivy Day celebrates the legacy of the famous Irish nationalist Charles Parnell. In this story, a group of political workers reflect on their work life and Parnell's memory. In A Mother, Mrs. Kearney is an overly ambitious mother who embarrasses herself and her daughter Kathleen during a concert. In Grace, a group of friends hope that religion can help straighten out the bumbling drinker Tom Kernan. And in probably the most famous story in Dubliners, The Dead, it follows Gabriel and his wife as they attend a party. Overcome by melancholy, Gabriel reminisces about his life and considers middle age. We're focusing on Dubliners in this section, but in order to understand its significance, it does help to know a little about how this book fits into Joyce's career. Over time, Joyce became deeply invested in the literary style of modernism, and his later books were highly experimental, both in terms of subject matter, prostitutes and masturbation figure in, and style. He wrote some nearly incomprehensible passages, such as this one from Finnegan's Wake. At the end of the book, "And here, us then, Finn again, take, bus a flea, memory." We don't see those techniques in Dubliners, but we can trace some of the beginnings of Joyce's particular relationship to writing. For example, the stories in Dubliners revolve around everyday people. Schoolboys, alcoholic clerks, and boarding house mistresses are some of the characters we meet. Although the prose is relatively plain and direct, without a lot of ornamentation, we do have some faint hints at stream of consciousness, in which we are let directly into a character's innermost thoughts, which trail and wander here and there. Finally, we do see in Dubliners some of Joyce's disregard for the traditional plot structure. Many of these stories revolve around an epiphany, or moment of personal revelation at the end. This is part of Joyce's attempt to focus on the private, inner lives of his characters, rather than on dramatic external events. Generally, these stories read like little postcards of daily life. They don't make use of a conventional plot structure that includes an inciting incident, long exposition, dramatic climax, and final resolution. Now that we've seen a bit of the stories themselves, let's consider the other important feature of Dubliners, its portrayal of Irish life at the turn of the century. Ireland was still ruled by England, and the country was divided among loyalists to the crown and nationalists who wanted independence. The country was further divided by religious tension, with Protestants and Catholics at odds with one another, sometimes violently. All these divisions and changes made Ireland an exciting but unstable place to be, as political factions clashed and loyalties divided family and friends. Irish intellectuals and artists like Joyce used their work to search for a unique Irish identity, drawing on traditional Irish language and history, as well as widespread hopes for a new future. As you might guess from the title, all of the stories in Dubliners take place in Dublin, the country's capital city. Religious, political, and economic tensions permeate the daily lives of the characters, who struggle to find love, money, and self-knowledge in the city's bustling streets and quiet backrooms. Published tell the story of Wing Biddlebaum, the main character, is a story of hands. But how can that be? Sherwood Anderson's Hands tell the story of Wing Biddlebaum, and it is indeed a story of hands. We are introduced to Wing's hands in the same sentence wherein we are told his name. His hands and their nervous flitting remain central, as we learn of the derision the people of Winesburg, Ohio, have for this neighbor of theirs. The name Wing was actually given to him in mockery of the way his hands are always fluttering. We learn that Wing did not think of himself as in any way a part of the life of the town, where he had lived for 20 years, which tells us of his isolation and loneliness, as does the eager anticipation with which he paces his front porch as the story opens, hoping George Willard will visit him. George seems to be the one person to whom Wing has any connection with in the town. The story of friendship between Wing and George is also a story of hands. We learn that Wing's hands, just as his personality, are freed in the presence of young George. In George's company, Wing's hands come forth and become the piston rods of his machinery of expression. Hands again drive the plot of this vignette, as one night while with George, Wing forgot the hands and allowed them first to rest on George's shoulders and then to caress his face. At this moment of expression, a look of horror swept over his face, and we are thrust backward in time, where we learn that Wing Biddlebaum is actually Adolph Myers, who was once a very successful teacher in a small Pennsylvania town. As the young teacher Adolph Myers, Wing Biddlebaum was adored by his students and used his hands as an untainted medium of expression. As he taught them, here and there went his hands, caressing the shoulders of the boys, playing about the tousled heads. Far from being a subject of mockery, the hands seemed to be a catalyst for learning. Under the caress of his hands, doubt and disbelief went out of the minds of the boys, and they began also to dream. Tragically, these caresses were made sinister by false accusations of one student. The townspeople believed the boy's tales and turned violently on Adolph Myers, beating him and chasing him away. "Keep your hands to yourself," they demanded. It is from this past that Adolph Myers fled, arriving in Winesburg, Ohio, to seek refuge with an aged aunt. He changed his name, separated himself from society, and worked quietly as a berry picker. In forcing his hands to do this mundane work, he forbade them from their expressiveness, and tried desperately to keep them hidden away. Wing Biddlebaum's isolation and loneliness are poignantly expressed as the story returns to the present at the end. George Willard does not come. Wing eats a solitary dinner and prepares to go to bed, alone and dejected. The vignette closes with Wing stooping to eat stray crumbs from the floor, his hands again the central focus of the story, as they carry the crumbs to his mouth one by one with unbelievable rapidity. Published in 1919, Hands falls into the modernist movement in literature. As many modernist texts do, Hands seeks to explore the existence of truth and our ability to access it. The story challenges readers to question things presented as truth and to consider the process whereby we believe we learn true things. The text presents several facts that are later called into question. The story is supposedly about a character named Wing Biddlebaum. However, we find out that his real name is Adolph Myers. Similarly, we are also told that Wing, Adolph, is a fat little old man, but later we learn he was but 40 but looked 65, and thus he isn't old at all. With these reversals of information, the reader is left to wonder what other information presented in the story might be incorrect, and whether it is possible to ever know for sure. The existence of and our access to the truth are also brought into question in the recounting of Wing Biddlebaum's past life. We learn that one of his students imagined unspeakable things in his bed one night, and in the morning went forth to tell his dreams as facts. So easily and so quickly, this boy's fanciful imaginings become galvanized truth. Furthermore, as the town accepted the boy's story, we read that shadowy doubts that had been in men's minds concerning Adolph Myers were galvanized into beliefs. Again, there is an alarmingly smooth transition from fiction to fact, which brings into question the validity of all facts. We are told that if the story of Wing Biddlebaum's hands was accurately presented, it would tap many strange, beautiful qualities in obscure men. Wing's hands were originally something beautiful. As a young teacher, his voice and the hands, the stroking of the shoulders and the touching of their hair, were a part of the schoolmaster's effort to carry a dream into the young minds. There was nothing sinister in them until they were vilified by untruths and hatred. After being chased out of Pennsylvania, Wing began his efforts to suppress his hands and all they longed to express. The townspeople made fun of him and could not find value in the beauty of his hands. The only value they could understand was that of the quantity of berries his hands could pick. Wing tries to help George Willard understand the value of beauty, as he pleads with him, "You must try to forget all you have learned. You must begin to dream. From this time on, you must shut your ears to the roaring of the voices." It is the things one learns from the roaring voices of society that robs beauty of its worth, as we see in the vilifying and degrading of Wing Biddlebaum's Hands. Hands is one story among many in Sherwood Anderson's book Winesburg, Ohio. The very first story in the book is called The Book of the Grotesque, in which we learn of a writer who is inspired to create a book containing truths. Hundreds and hundreds were the truths, and they were all beautiful. And then the people came along. The moment one of the people took one of the truths to himself, he became a grotesque, and the truth he embraced became a falsehood. This provides a preface for the rest of the book, and it implies the stories that follow are actually the creations mentioned by this author in the Book of the Grotesque. As such, we are supposed to view the characters found therein as grotesques. To be grotesque is to be somehow ludicrous, distorted, and/or repulsive. As noted, we are instructed to see the effort to embrace and own truth as the means whereby one becomes grotesque. Wing Biddlebaum is made grotesque by the truth that would be expressed by his hands. His attempt to convey the influence for which the hands were but fluttering pennants of promise leads to his vilification in Pennsylvania and his subsequent flight to Ohio. He spends the rest of his life fearing his hands and trying to suppress them. In doing so, he becomes the distorted and ludicrous character we meet pacing nervously on his front porch. He is an oddity in a town of odd people. He is a grotesque.
There's an old quote credited to different origins that says, "Everyone is crazy except me and thee, and sometimes I'm not sure about thee." In Diary of a Madman, a short story by Lu Xun that serves as an allegory for its time period, the person who manages to make the most sense of the world is a man who is considered mentally ill. Let's analyze and interpret this story. This work was published at the beginning of the 20th century, which was soon after the Boxer Rebellion, a violent conflict during which many foreigners in China were executed and led to a massive international intervention, but half a century before the People's Republic of China was established. During this time, there was a big outcry against Western influences and capitalism, which were blamed for instability in the region. This story is based on the author's belief that China is in dire need of a cultural shift that's more humanistic in nature. This allegory is structured as a story within a story. On the surface, the first-person narrator is a man who hears of an illness of one of his friends and goes to check on him. When he arrives, the friend's brother says that the friend is no longer ill, but provides the man with a copy of the diary so that the man can understand what his friend was going through. The remainder of the story consists of an undated diary. In the first entry, the friend writes, "I have not seen it for over 30 years, so today, when I saw it, I felt in unusually high spirits. I begin to realize that during the past 30-odd years, I have been in the dark, but now I must be extremely careful." At this point in the story, it appears that the man is hallucinating, as he is so paranoid that he believes even the neighbor's dog is suspicious of him for some reason. As the diary continues, the paranoia grows to include nearly every living being the narrator of the diary encounters. By the third entry, the madman is raving about cannibalism and fear, but upon examination, fear makes more sense than the desensitization of the madness he sees in the world all around him. Others don't even seem to react when people around them are jailed, driven to suicide, engage in violent vigilante justice, or defend the indefensible. But when the narrator responds, he's treated as if he's insane and kept inside. As the man's observations are some of the things that still occur, even in America, the reader is forced to examine some of the insane behavior that's become part of our indoctrinated culture. Soon, he's convinced that his caretakers are working together to drive him to suicide so they can remain blameless as they cannibalize him. The narrator confronts his brother and tells him that he's aware that at one time cannibalism was acceptable and that he understands that there are some that don't know any better, but most do and continue to indulge. After their 5-year-old sister dies, the narrator is convinced that his brother is the one who killed her, but their mother turned the other way. The narrator suspects that bits of his sister are being put in his food and wonders if there is anyone left who hasn't participated in cannibalism. The diary ends with "Save the children." We learned at the beginning of the story that the man is better and is now a civil servant, which indicates that a person who doesn't conform and become part of the corrupt society is branded a madman, as written in the title. The condition of the moon is noted, whether bright or absent, which is fairly common in Chinese literature. It's used both to set the mood of the story and to symbolize lightness and darkness. The moon is bright when the diarist comes to a new realization, but is absent during the moments that he becomes overly obsessed with those around him. Cannibalism in this story is more than the literal ingestion of human flesh by another human being, and is a metaphor for the way that corrupt leaders use their power against their followers. Symbols of dogs and other canines, including hyenas and wolves, are used to describe the carnivorous animal instincts of the people around him. The diary narrator writes, "I remember reading somewhere of a hideous beast with an ugly look in its eye called hyena, which often eats dead flesh. Even the largest bones it grinds into fragments and swallows." All right, let's now take a moment to review all of the information.
Was a modernist poet from the 20th century who wrote a famous group of over 200 poems called the Spoon River Anthology. These poems were told by fictional characters from the fictional town of Spoon River. They were told after the characters' deaths, and most of them reveal secrets or regrets that no one knew while they were alive. Like many modernist poems, Master's poems were written in free verse. That is, they do not have a specific rhyme and meter to them. Edgar Lee Masters grew up in a small town in the Midwest. Back then, it was believed that all of the bad things of society, drugs, murder, and all sorts of other crimes, were only present in the big cities. Midwestern small towns were portrayed in literature with rosy tones. All the people were kind and civilized, and they never did the kind of bad things that people from the cities did. The truth, of course, was that the small towns were just as bad as big cities, and Edgar Lee Masters' experiences growing up showed him that the people around him weren't as good and perfect as they wanted to present themselves. Through the voices of his characters, Masters shows how the bad things associated with the big cities, lies and drugs and crime, were also present in small towns. The fact that he critiqued small-town life was a huge deal back then, and opened the door for other modernist writers to do the same. Let's look at two of the Spoon River poems and their significance. One of the more shocking of Masters' poems is that of Amanda Barker. Let's read the poem and then look at what it means. Amanda Barker. Henry got me with child, knowing that I could not bring forth life without losing my own. In my youth, therefore, I entered the portals of dust. Traveler, it is believed in the village where I lived that Henry loved me with a husband's love, but I proclaim from the dust that he slew me to gratify his hatred. Like the other poems in the anthology, this poem is named for its narrator, in this case a woman named Amanda Barker. The second and third lines, "I could not bring forth life without losing my own," tell us that she died in childbirth. But that's not the interesting part. The really interesting part is that her husband Henry intentionally made her pregnant even though he knew that she would not survive childbirth. She says that the townspeople all believed that her husband loved her like any husband, but she says that he slew her, meaning that he murdered her, to gratify his hatred. In other words, he got away with the perfect murder. If your wife has been told that she'll die in childbirth, get her pregnant, and when she dies, everyone will think that you were a loving husband instead of a murderer. The poem brings up an important theme, one that is common in the anthology, that you can't know the secrets of your neighbors. They might seem like good people, but they might not be. When this poem was published, it shocked readers because of the idea that the very people they knew might be harboring secrets like this one. Let's look at another poem from the Spoon River anthology. This one, Deacon Taylor, isn't about murder, but it too deals with the theme of secrets. Deacon Taylor. I belonged to the church and to the party of prohibition, and the villagers thought I died of eating watermelon. In truth, I had cirrhosis of the liver. For every noon for 30 years, I slipped behind the prescription partition in Trainor's drugstore and poured a generous drink from the bottle marked Spiritus Frumenti. First of all, you might be wondering what it was that he drank that killed him. Spiritus Frumenti is an old-fashioned name for whiskey. So basically, old Deacon Taylor was an alcoholic who secretly drank whiskey every day at lunchtime. But why did he keep it a secret? We get one hint in the title of the poem. Deacon wasn't his first name, but his position in the church. A deacon is a church leader who is not a preacher. Deacon Taylor, then, was a leader in his church. The second line also tells us that he was a member of the party of prohibition. In other words, besides being an upstanding member of his church community, he was in favor of prohibition, which was the movement in the early 20th century to make alcohol an illegal drug. So while he was preaching about how people should not be allowed to drink alcohol, he was secretly drinking every day. The poem turns a light on the hypocrisy of Deacon Taylor and men like him. Many of Master's characters are hypocrites who say one thing and do another, or judge the people in their town for doing the same things that they do in secret. You can imagine how readers from small towns felt about Masters implying that there were a lot of hypocrites living among them.
Can a crime ever be justified? This is one of the questions at the heart of A Jury of Her Peers, the expanded short story version of Susan Glaspell's one-act play, Trifles. In A Jury of Her Peers, can a crime ever be justified? This is one of the questions at the heart of A Jury of Her Peers, the expanded short story version of Susan Glaspell's one-act play, Trifles. In A Jury of Her Peers, Glaspell examines several themes tied to ideas of justice. Let's go through a brief summary of the plot before diving into some analysis of how setting and characters work in the story. When Lewis Hale visited the Wright farm to ask John Wright again about chipping in on a telephone for their country road, the last thing he expected was to find a disheveled Minnie Wright in her rocking chair, and John's corpse strangled by a rope still in their bed. Now Sheriff Peters and Henderson, the county attorney, have asked Mr. Hale to accompany them to the Wright farm to tell his story and help them look for clues. The sheriff's wife, Miss Peters, has to come along to pick up some things Minnie's asked for, and she's requested that Martha Hale come along too. We spend most of our time in the Wright kitchen with Miss Peters and Martha while the men go through the rest of the house looking for any evidence of a motive. The men, especially Henderson, find Minnie's housekeeping skills somewhat lacking and scoff at the idea that women's work around the house could be considered anything more than trifles. Martha tries to stand up for her former friend, even as she's feeling guilty for never coming over to the house because it never seemed a cheerful place, due to John's cold attitude and penny pinching. Martha remembers how Minnie used to be a happy girl with a beautiful singing voice. As the men search other areas of the house, the women stay in the kitchen. They find a quilt Minnie had been working on. Most of the stitches are neat, but the latest sewing is haphazard. The men, passing through on their way to the barn, laugh when they overhear the women wonder whether Minnie was going to quilt it or just knot it. Alone again, the women find an empty birdcage with a broken door hinge and no sign of a bird. That bird's body shows up inside a decorative red box in Minnie's sewing box, dead from a wrung neck, very similar to John's. Seeing this bird makes it all click for the women, how the bird singing must have brightened Minnie's life, and how devastated she must have been when it was killed. Neither knows what to do, but a little while later, when the men come in declaring they've found no clues, the women quickly hide the dead bird. The setting of Glaspell's story helps to highlight Minnie's lonely situation. While there's physical distance between all the neighbors on their country road, the Wrights are especially secluded. This is evident in the fact that John has no interest in installing a telephone. Through Martha's comparisons of a younger, brighter Minnie with the withdrawn, gloomy woman she became over the years, we are shown the devastating effects of this remoteness. Minnie's physical isolation mirrors the emotional loneliness we know she feels by reading about Martha's guilt over not visiting. This isolation is not the only important point to be made about the setting, however. Equally important is the fact that the action of the story takes place in the kitchen, a space traditionally associated with women and women's work throughout history. Since gender roles are a central theme of this story, setting the action in the kitchen helps pull us into the female character's world. If we weren't sympathetic to the women after witnessing the men belittle them and their roles, being placed in this feminine area pulls us more strongly to the women's side. Glaspell's emphasis on the line drawn between the sexes accomplishes a couple of things. The men's consistent belittling of the women's roles in the home actually serves to highlight just how important women's work actually is. Adding to this irony is the fact that it's the women who are able to solve the crime, precisely because the men's inability to value women's work means they can't put themselves in Minnie's shoes. For the men, this case is cut and dry. Minnie killed John, and therefore she must be punished. For the women, things aren't that simple. Both Mrs. Peters and Martha can understand how lonely it can feel being in the house all day. Not only does Martha feel guilty about not maintaining a friendship with Minnie, but she's also vocal about how she knows how difficult women's work in the home can be. Mrs. Peters has her own experience that stirred empathy for Minnie. Her experience as a child when a little boy killed her pet cat, and her experience with loneliness and despair after her baby died. Because they're able to empathize with Minnie, these women turn out to be the peers best fit to judge whether Minnie's crime was justified. With this focus on the necessity of women sticking together, Glaspell highlights the importance of empathy. In a jury of her peers, Minnie Wright has killed her husband.
Though he was born over 150 years ago, Irish author George Bernard Shaw comes off as an incredibly modern and relevant man. He's also an incredibly accomplished man, the kind of accomplished that might make you think, what am I doing with my life? Like one of those annoying cousins that you probably have that makes everyone else in the family look bad because they're perfect. For instance, he's the only person in existence to ever win both a Nobel Prize in Literature and an Oscar. He helped establish the London School of Economics, which is one of Europe and really the world's premier institutions of higher education. He made his name and some good money writing critiques of music and plays before producing his own. In total, he wrote over 60 stage productions, many of which achieved substantial financial and popular success. These are just some of the feats of the 94 years of his life, so if you're younger than 94, you still have time to catch up. And they've earned him a great spot amongst the literary greats of Western culture. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's dig a little bit into Shaw's life and look at a few of his major works to get a better understanding of this great figure in Western literature. Shaw was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1856 to a struggling grain merchant, his father, and a singer, his mother. He received an education at a number of institutions as a kid, but he wasn't a big fan of the school system in general, preferring to self-guide his study and work alongside of his father. When Shaw was about 16 years old, his mother absconded to London with her singing coach and Shaw's sisters, which is kind of an exciting scandal, probably not so much for Shaw. He actually ended up joining them when he was 21, continuing his fervent studies and trying to begin a writing career by authoring some novels. No one was really interested in publishing those novels, but Shaw was able to eke out a bit of money ghostwriting a column on music for his mother's coach. This opportunity defined the early stages of his writing career, where he derived his income from living as a critic. He was notable especially for his essays on stage productions and music. Although Shaw is now more celebrated for the plays that he wrote himself, he was no slouch in the criticism department. Some scholars credit his incisive pen, for instance, with ending the long tradition of theatrical companies editing Shakespeare down into acting versions that really gutted their potency and, really kind of took away what makes Shakespeare Shakespeare. Similarly, his music writing was known for its ability to appeal to any well-read person. It stood in contrast to the more boring, pedantic work usually associated with music criticism of its day. Shaw used this position to champion not only original productions of Shakespeare, but also the skill of contemporary playwright Henrik Ibsen and famed German composer Richard Wagner. Both of these subjects eventually got the full book treatment from Shaw. Ibsen you might know from The Wild Duck or A Doll's House, and Richard Wagner wrote a number of operas that were a really big deal in Germany, and King Ludwig Maximilian was a big fan of Wagner's. He's most famous for a series of operas called The Ring Cycle, which are awesome, and also very similar in plot to The Lord of the Rings. During this time, Shaw kept plugging away at his novels, publishing a total of 5 throughout of his life. All of them were published many years after they were written. However, in a case of proving the adage, write what you know, it would be Shaw's staged plays, a form he had spent years studying and critiquing, that would really bring him his greatest success. So as I mentioned, Shaw has wrote over 60 plays in his lifetime, which is a ton. It would be impossible for us to do justice to most of them in this video, so I'm just going to pick a few of the key highlights that show up the depth of his career, and also the ones that he's really most well known for. Before getting into specifics, it'd be helpful to keep in mind a few of the common elements that really appear in all of Shaw's work and can help you identify something as a piece of Shaw. First is really a sharp critique of society. Shaw was a notable social activist in his day. He was a proud socialist and a founding member of one of England's major socialist groups, the Fabians, who are credited with helping to form the Labour Party, which is one of the UK's two major parties today. Shaw hated the exploitation of the working class, and he saw that rampant in Western society. He used his plays as a vehicle to challenge this and what he perceived as other social ills. In fact, the published versions of his plays would often include prefaces, some longer than the plays themselves, spelling out the philosophical background that led Shaw to write that particular work. Other hard-held beliefs that Shaw was known for include vegetarianism and the idea that property should be owned publicly and not privately. The second major trait of Shaw's work is a strong sense of humor, and that's part of I think what makes his work still beloved is that there's a lot of funny stuff in there. Shaw always tempered his social critiques with laughs, and though these were often more of like a darker and sarcastic and witty sense of humor, sort of like a slightly less vulgar South Park. His humor had a ton of admirers, including England's King George VII, who once laughed so hard at a Shaw play that he broke his chair. In fact, Shaw's plays were often well received, not only because of, but sometimes in spite of their social messages. So maybe people didn't really like what Shaw had to say, but they thought it was so funny they didn't care. The audiences of his day weren't necessarily as interested in social change as they were in just watching a fun show. And this is something you can probably see in modern audiences as well. With that prelude out of the way, let's talk about the 5 of his most famous works. First, we'll address some of his more philosophical plays. Among those is 1903's Man and Superman. Chronologically, this story is published in between philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's use of the term Superman, or in German Übermensch, and the famous comic book character. This is Shaw's take on the classic Don Juan legend, a tale about an amorous man's quest for love. Shaw kind of inversed this story, though, by having his main male character, John Tanner, constantly trying to ward off the advances of a seductress named Anne Whitefield. We talked earlier about Shaw's social critique, and it's really strong in this play. In fact, Man and Superman lays out some of Shaw's key philosophies. For one, it gives him a chance to introduce his idea of the life force, a drive that pushes humankind towards its ultimate evolution as sophisticated free thinkers. Shaw believed that women possessed this force to seek out and mate with superior men, thus producing the most perfect children possible. And so these are the supermen that Shaw speaks of. It's not like Superman, it's a bird, it's a plane. Shaw's idea of eugenics, or controlling the human population through regulated reproduction, were actually embraced by the early Nazi Party, although Shaw never intended such an inhumane application of the idea. Eugenics is an idea that only like the most intelligent or most talented people should mate with each other to produce the most intelligent and talented children. I'm sure you can see a lot of problems with this theory, and its adaptation by the Nazi Party kind of points in that direction. Shaw's philosophies began to change a bit in 1919's Heartbreak House, which is his first post-World War I work. The effects of the war on Shaw's optimistic philosophies about the Superman are really made obvious here. Notably, Shaw uses this play, which is a family drama in which no one is who they appear, to question whether society can affect the capability for change. And that play kind of explains 1921's Back to Methuselah, a massive 5-play epic, which is really meant to be read and not performed, in which Shaw revisits this notion of the life force and the Superman, but although somewhat indirectly. The title references a big biblical figure known as the oldest person ever to live. These 5 plays take place across time, starting in 4004 BC and ending in 31,920 AD, so really, really distant future. Here, Shaw finally lays out his idea that humans will need to live longer individual lifespans in order to truly learn how to govern themselves. Each play in Methuselah is set in a different time, and as time progresses, human beings discover the necessity of extending their lives in order to grow more sensible. By the end of the play, in the year 31,920, short livers are only a memory. People live for ages and are, in fact, born into maturity. Shaw presents this as the eventual human ideal to be achieved. Back to Methuselah is a rare example of Shaw engaging with science fiction, although you might imagine that he had more political than scientific interests when writing these plays. The biological process by which Shaw's characters attain longevity isn't as important as the idea behind it. That is, as they live now, people just aren't ready for that kind of power or responsibility. So those are pretty heavy plays, pretty heavy ideals, maybe not the kind of thing you'd want to go do on a Saturday night. So let's get away from some of those more ponderous works and look at his more popular stuff. Let's start by talking about St. Joan, which was produced in 1923, widely regarded as one of Shaw's best works. In fact, it's suspected that St. Joan is what's responsible for Shaw's Nobel Prize in Literature. As you may guess from the title, St. Joan is based on the life and trial of Joan of Arc, the 15th century figure, persecuted French warrior who the Catholic Church finally canonized as a saint just 3 years before this was written, performing really an about-face on their position on her, which that event probably provided Shaw with his inspiration for the play. This play is characterized as Shaw's only tragedy and notably does not really feature any villains. Shaw believed that the drama was more interesting when every character thought he or she possessed truly noble motivations. It's perhaps this nuanced, although historically inaccurate, some claim, dramatization of Joan of Arc's turbulent story that led to its massive popularity. However, stepping back in time a bit, in 1912 we see Shaw produce what has become somewhat indirectly his most famous work, and that's Pygmalion. This is the story of a lower-class flower girl, not like a flower girl in a wedding. Her name's Eliza Doolittle. She takes lessons on high society from someone named Professor Henry Higgins in an effort to see if she can be passed off for an upper-class lady. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's the basis for the popular musical My Fair Lady. This work is what also netted Shaw the Oscar that we mentioned earlier. Shaw co-wrote the 1938 adaptation of Pygmalion for film, and of course there would also be a film of My Fair Lady starring the incomparable Audrey Hepburn.
The truth is, insurance companies make the claims process as difficult as possible so you get
The glorious motion picture now comes back to the audiences that have paid their tribute in almost unceasing applause. Warner Brothers takes pride in announcing special selected engagements of My Fair Lady.
What about your boast that you could pass her off as a duchess at the embassy ball, eh? I'll say you're the greatest teacher alive if you can make that good. I'll bet you all the expenses of the experiment that you can't do it.
Oh, you're real good. Thank you, Captain.
You know, it's almost irresistible. She's so deliciously low, so horribly dirty.
Man, an arm of iron, but with a little bit of luck, with a little bit of luck, someone else will do the blinking work.
Every duke and earl and peer is here. Everyone who should be here is here. What a smashing, positively dashing, spectacularly Ascot's opening day.
The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain.
Again.
The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain.
By George, she's got it. By George, she's got it. Now once again, where does it rain?
On the plain, on the plain.
And where's that soggy plain?
In Spain, in Spain.
The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain. Bravo!
I could have danced all night. I could have danced all night.
Your eyes are red.
And still
Now say good night. Please turn out the light. Please, it's really time for you to be in bed.
I could have spread
come on,
my wings.
That's your toad. Oh, Mrs. Pierce is apt to scold. You're not too late. He's as sure as fate. Miss, you'll catch a cold.
The joke me down if I wouldn't get her out of town.
People stop and stare, they don't bother me, for there's nowhere else on earth that I would rather be. Let the time go by, I won't care if I can be here on the street where you live.
The twin elements of social critique and comedy that I touched upon earlier are really apparent in Pygmalion and also in My Fair Lady. While the main idea of the play has a lot of opportunities for humor in it, trying to make a poor person act and sound like a rich person is a pretty classic plot for a farce. The situation that Shaw sets up is also fertile ground to pick apart the trivialities of upper-class England. And as a socialist, this is something that Shaw probably would be really interested in doing, is, pointing out the frivolity of the people he opposes, essentially. There's also a lot in the play about societal roles and the potential objectification of women. This is philosophically a loaded work that's also incredibly entertaining. If Shaw's legacy were to be condensed into one play, I think it would be Pygmalion. Of course, when you've got a career as storied as Shaw's, there's no way to condense it all into just one play. But
I don't know. Maybe Mary Wollstonecraft. All right, so it's time for the nonfiction glasses again, because we are entering the exciting world of nonfiction. And when you hear the term power couple, right, who comes to mind? It might be Jay-Z and Beyonce, might be Bill and Hillary Clinton, might be Jim and Pam. I don't know. Maybe Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. Maybe. I can picture your faces right now. You're all going like, I don't know. You're also probably laughing at the glasses a little bit. But even though they were only married for, I'm not going to talk about those other people. I'm going to talk about Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. They were married for only a few months in the spring and summer of 1797. They were really kind of, famous sort of luminaries of 18th century England. They were really smart people, and they ended up together, which is kind of the definition of a power couple. So that's why we're talking about them. They both did really groundbreaking work in their respective fields. Wollstonecraft is kind of widely regarded as a real trailblazing feminist. And Godwin was really the first anarchist of the modern era, as well as the first man to write a mystery or thriller novel. So you can thank him for John Grisham and all those people to come after him. Together, they produced only one work really worth considering, and that was their daughter, Mary Shelley, who would go on to write Frankenstein. Also, Mary, the poet Percy Shelley, and that's how she got the name Shelley and not Godwin or Wollstonecraft. And their thoughts and passions and all of that stuff kind of really had influence on each other. They really wrote separately. They were sort of separate, luminaries on their own. Much of Wollstonecraft's work comes first chronologically and probably has a larger impact. She kind of outshadows her husband a little bit in that respect. We will look at her first and what she did. So Mary Wollstonecraft, born in 1759, she would basically, she didn't live that long, but throughout her short life, she would become basically a pioneer for women's rights. The movement she helped inspire, really women's suffrage and feminism in general, would happen way, way, way long after her death. she does play a part in at least kind of kicking that off. That's really what she's most significant for. Her earliest written texts were about education, which is not so much of a surprise since her first two jobs were as a school teacher and a governess. She had a particular interest in educating women and sort of helping to free them from kind of degraded status in society. And in doing this through learning is really what she thought was the path to this. And her earliest work is the Female Reader is basically an edited anthology of literary passages. And then her own sort of original work, Thoughts on Education of Daughters. These are both works that really express this, that really get at the idea that if we want to help women out, we should really educate them, and we should help in any way we can to make that happen. She's arguing basically that children of both sexes need education. And, in crucial areas, self-discipline, honesty, and especially reason. Reason is really important to her. And, this is actually picked up, this strain of sort of the importance of female education is actually picked up much later in the early 20th century by Virginia Woolf, who's a modernist writer and a feminist, when that movement was really getting going. And, in her Room of One's Own, which is kind of a famous feminist tract, she picks right up on this idea that women need to be educated. She posits this fictional Shakespeare's sister who, could have been a genius too, but didn't get to go to school. So this idea really has long-lasting kind of resonances. Emphasis on education, makes sense. One of the key traits connecting Wollstonecraft and Godwin and all those other major thinkers is this emphasis of rationality over emotion, which is something that you probably have to learn in school. It's not necessarily natural. And in Education of Daughters, Wollstonecraft's later aspects of her later work can be found. It's not exactly an out-and-out defense of women, and it's not exactly an attack of sort of the total patriarchy system that her other texts would be. But she really basically says that women need to be educated because then they're in a position to just contribute better to society. Even if that's as wives and mothers, they're in a better position to contribute if they've gone to school. Her next kind of famous work, 1790, she writes this thing called The Vindication of the Rights of Man. And this is in response to in 1790, the Bastille has been stormed in the French Revolution in France. And she's writing in response to this guy Edmund Burke, who is writing in response to that, and he writes this thing called Reflections on the Revolution in France. And she thought that this thing was absurd. Like, it was just the stupidest defense of monarchy ever. And she was so mad at him that she wrote this thing called The Vindication of the Rights of Man, which is a pro-republic, sort of anti-aristocracy thing that really harshly strikes at social convention and government opulence. She doesn't just rebuke Burke's arguments, right? She does so using gendered language, and this is the really important part. She's basically arguing that if the citizens of France were to leap from their scabbards to avenge even a look that threatened Marie Antoinette, that's what Burke was arguing, that France's noblemen would be guilty of the same emotional overreaction that's typically made fun of in women. That's basically her argument. They'd be swayed by his theatricality and not convinced by his reason. Follows this up in 1792 with the Vindication of the Rights of Women, which you might expect would be coming soon from a feminist. And the key to the rights of women, it really wouldn't be unfamiliar to people who'd read her other work, Education of Daughters. It goes back to this idea that women need education. They're essential to the country's operation because they educate the children and they're companions to the men. And also the key thing is that they're not property, right? They should have the same basic rights as men, such as liberty and the ability to pursue education, in kind of the same ideals as were being, discussed a lot in reference to the French Revolution, because that's what they were after for their citizens. And even though, right, so Wollstonecraft is a radical in her day for saying things like this. If you read it today, you'd probably be a little shocked, right, at like how antiquated it still seems, but that just sort of goes to show how backward things really were. Wollstonecraft still refers to marriage as a cement of society. She doesn't want to toss out everything. She harshly critiques subjects, who give in, both men and women, right, who give in too quickly to sensibility or wild emotions, right? She's very into reason and things like that. And, you know, she doesn't outright say, this is kind of the thing that might seem most familiar to modern feminists, she doesn't outright say that men and women are equal. She just says that they all should have the same fundamental rights. And, you know, there are bits where she says what men can do and what women can't. You know, physical attributes is a lot of what she mentions. Besides these writings, you know, or political tracts or educational tracts, she contributed a lot to, you know, other literary styles. She wrote a travelogue, she wrote a history of the French Revolution, she wrote a children's book. It was her ideas about women that were the most, you know, the most attention-grabbing. She really sadly died in childbirth. She died from complications of giving birth to her daughter Mary. And afterward, William Godwin decided to publish a memoir of her that ended up really shocking lots of people. He kind of talked about affairs she'd had, suicide attempts, you know. And this basically cast any scholarship of Wollstonecraft under such a dark cloud for such a long time that only kind of with, you know, 20th century movement, women's suffrage and feminism, did we actually start to look at her more closely, because he basically ruined her legacy by publishing this book. He had the best of intentions in doing so, though. He really didn't think that this was going to mess up her reputation as much as it did, and he was grieving, so he kind of wanted to do something to commemorate her. But, you know, again, despite his intent, he kind of single-handedly, you know, resulted in her falling from critical grace. But let's back up. He didn't just do that. He didn't just mess up his wife's reputation. You know, we mentioned before, he could really be called the first modern anarchist. You know, and he's just a person, you know, anarchists are basically just people who don't like the government, and they think it should go away. If you're me, you might think of Ferris Bueller's kind of nonsensical statement, they could be fascist anarchists for all I care, it still wouldn't change the fact that I don't own a car. But, you know, like Wollstonecraft's feminism, Godwin's anarchy was extreme at the time, but looking pretty tame by our standards. Just a little background on him. He's born in Weisbeck, England, not Germany, in 1756. He's one of 13 children. Oh my God, that's a lot of kids. He was trained as a minister at Hoxford Academy, and Godwin always had an eye sort of towards reform and writing, and in 1782 he moved to London, and he wrote several novels and essays, you know, most of which have been ignored or lost to history, probably because they weren't that good. And, you know, kind of in the same way that the French Revolution was really important for Mary Wollstonecraft's, like, breakthrough writing, do the same for Godwin in 1793. He's, you know, upset about what he considers kind of harmful social structures like monarchy and even marriage. He's not that into that. He writes an enquiry concerning political justice and its influence on general virtue and happiness. They really knew how to do titles back then. Our titles these days, short, to the point, no. Just cram everything in there. And it's basically a verbal attack on institutions that he saw as useless. So that's where the anarchy comes in. He's just like, why do we need these things? We can just be on our own. He basically thought that any kind of social institution, you know, government or, you know, any kind of regulation was basically a restraint on the progress of mankind. He said that government, by its very nature, counteracts the improvement of the original mind. So, you know, if left to their own devices, he thought that people would, you know, employing reason, and again, that's the key concept here, would create a better society divorced from all evil that favored what, you know, some critics refer to as voluntary communism. You know, and Godwin's ideas might not really be sustainable on a grand scale, and he even admits that, you know, government has a role in the short term, right? Because honestly, you know, if the key thing is that people are going to behave rationally, I think we can admit that that's probably not a realistic assumption about most people, especially, you know, people we see in our daily lives. But, you know, the ideas like Godwin's, you know, it earns him the honor again of being this sort of first anarchist of the modern era, right? Although it's important to say that he's a gradualist anarchist, meaning that he thinks that change should come eventually, and, you know, through kind of calm discussion. He's not a revolutionary. He's not going to tear down the wall or whatever. Besides his political text, he also, you know, wrote, again, what's sort of considered the first mystery thriller novel in 1794 called Things as They Are, or The Adventures of Caleb Williams, also a great title. And this is a fictional companion to his political work, to The Enquiry, that attacked aristocracy. And Caleb Williams kind of did it through a story in which the servant learns a dark secret and has to flee his master. Caleb Williams starts at the end and works backwards, which is still kind of a tactic employed by suspense writers, or, you know, the movie Memento, which is awesome. And, he had a couple of other works up his sleeves, including the, memoirs of Wollstonecraft that destroyed her reputation. Enquiry and Caleb Williams are just his most significant contributions, after he mostly focused on novels and children's books, and returned to politics, but didn't really make the same splash, and passed away eventually in 1836, which is a long time after poor Mary Wollstonecraft. And, so that's just to sum them up, kind of celebrity power couple of the thinking world. They both produced kind of significant work.
I saw Mr. Shimeda when I was out hunting today. They got but one coat among them over there. Eating prairie dog mostly. I think they're starving.
Would you like to say the prayer?
Sure. Thank you, Lord, for the food on the table. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
We're going to visit our new neighbors. Bring them some cake, don't you think?
I was helping Antonia with her English.
I'm glad you're teaching Antonia.
Different time then. No money.
I think I'll go find a quiet spot, read this afternoon.
You go right ahead. Will you manage? That's a smart boy, Otto.
Yep.
Yeah, home sweet home.
How do you like your new room, huh?
It's nice. Where's yours?
I don't have a room.
Put it down there, Otto.
I'm moving on, Jim. Heading west. Sold him his oxen and 2 bony horses for the price of good work teams, and now he's trying to say it wasn't no sale of the farm, just a lease. And he ain't moved out. Sometimes folks do you that way when you first come here.
They don't believe how toxic this is. If you're still using a plastic or wooden cutting board, you need to hear this. I never post stuff like this.
Principal funding for Meet the Past with Crosby Kemper III is provided by the Courtney S. Turner Charitable Trust, with additional financial support from Ken and Cindy McLean of Independence, Missouri, and by these fine organizations.
Published The Great Gatsby. He wrote Willa Cather to say,
Quiet drama in my brain. Grasshopper.
Grace Hopper. Get out of here!
anybody else. You're a part of me. I'm coming back.
Even if you don't. You're still here.
All I have to do is close my eyes and I'm 10 years old again, running through the grass with you. Oh, I wish we could go back.
Oh, Jim. I think of everything we would miss.
And I carry her face with me always. The closest, realest face, under the shadows of all women's faces at the very bottom of my memory.
So Yeats, cool dude. He's a Nobel Prize winner. He is a senator, a magician, a businessman, a critic, and, oh yeah, a really good writer, which is why we're talking about him now. And he's also super interesting. William Butler Yeats is his full name, is WB for short. And he kind of joins an elite club of modernist writers who go by their initials. So we got T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, the poet H.D. She doesn't even use her last name. And before we go into Yeats's writing output, which was a lot and was very significant, a few kind of interesting, things to get to know him as a man first. And he's also, it's important to note that he's kind of a slightly earlier generation than most modernists, and he kind of spans, or he kind of evolves over time. He spans from mid, kind of turn of the century time into early modernism time, and kind of evolves as he goes. So he's kind of got a long and fruitful career. All right, so Yeats, he's an Irish guy. He's born in Dublin in 1865. He's part of a really artistic family. They're actually super encouraging of his writing and his painting. They take him to London so he can kind of better pursue it. Then they had to go back to Dublin for a little bit because they kind of ran out of money, but then they went back to London. And so he does a lot of moving around, which is also kind of helps him hone a bit of a sense of his Irishness, which is important because he's growing up at a time of really, national conflict, essentially. Turmoil, religious turmoil, national turmoil in Ireland. And because, during his lifetime, his home nation is trying to basically throw off the yoke of Great Britain. They're trying to establish self-rule. They try a bunch of times unsuccessfully, then they violently break in 1922. They break free. And all of this conflict really bears significant impact on Yeats's life and work, right? He's not like a violent revolutionary type guy, but he is a really strong nationalist, and he's considered a real major part of the heritage reclaiming Irish literary revival that was going on while he was alive. He was a huge part of that. And his political leanings are going to become much more obvious later on in life when he actually becomes one of the first senators appointed to the Irish Free State. So he gets into it more as he gets older, basically, which is usually the opposite of what happens with politics. He served two terms in the Senate before having to retire for health reasons. And he actually rallied against the Catholics for their intractability on the matters of divorce. That was one of his big stands. And he identified pretty strongly with the Northern Ireland Protestants, did not care much at all for Catholicism, so that's kind of his religious stance. He's sympathetic to Protestants, but his own kind of religious beliefs are a little weirder. He seems to kind of skewed a bit towards the occult and the mystic. He wasn't totally a fringe religious fanatic dude. He was definitely had a critical eye to it all, and was certainly had an independent thinker in such matters. But he was really fascinated with the paranormal. He was into Irish folklore. He kind of embraced metaphysical philosophy. He wrote at one point, just kind of an indication of how seriously he took it. He wrote, "The mystical life is the center of all that I do, and all that I think, and all that I write." And all of this, the mysticism and whatnot, really wasn't all that unusual at the time. This was kind of a time in which seances and Ouija boards were kind of getting going. So you might want to invite Yeats to your next sleepover. I don't know, you can figure out whether Michael likes you. So his writing, we've gone through a lot of his life and stuff, and so now we can actually talk about his work, which is really what he's most remembered for. We haven't even mentioned his messed up love life. Okay, we'll mention it for a second. He proposed to a mother and then to her daughter. What? Anyway, that's not important. His work was, you know, you can kind of divide it into three main stages of output. He's got his early days, which are kind of dominated by more like fantasy kind of writing, his middle days, which are more kind of social writing, and his later days, which are more spiritualist writing. So Yeats was first published in 1885 in the Dublin University Review. He writes some poetry, he writes an essay, like a critical work essentially. And his poems at this point, some key examples are The Isle of Statues, which is kind of an epic fantasy in the style of Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene that was written way back in the Renaissance. And you know, he also publishes The Wanderings of Oisin, a work heavily steeped in Irish mythology. This is kind of his experimental phase with like epic long poems that he's working on. He doesn't really do much of the long form after that, although the Wanderings poem really kind of cements his fascination with Irish heritage. 1890, he publishes, sort of in a collected edition in 1892, he publishes The Lake Isle of Innisfree, which is kind of a rustic poem that idealizes Ireland. He was living in London at this time, so it kind of is like hearkening to the homeland a bit. And it marks another attempt to really bring a clear Irish voice to English poetry. This time it's a short form, it's only 12 lines long, so that's a nice easy one to read. And he'd continue to write shorter things for most of his career. Lake Isle, like I mentioned before, is collected in 1892 in the Countess Kathleen and Various Legends and Lyrics, which is sounding really Irish, and you know, brings up kind of another point about Yeats, which is that in addition to being a poet, he was also a playwright. And the Countess Kathleen, which is this collection, is actually a play, or what the Countess Kathleen thing in the collection is a play. And a few years later, he actually has his first performed play, which is called The Land of Heart's Desire. Runs for 6 weeks in London. It's about a fairy, or he was kind of into fantasy before. It involves a fairy who successfully attempts to draw a mortal woman into the blissful immortality of the fairy world. And Yeats was actually so into drama that he opened up the Abbey Theatre in Dublin in 1904, which was kind of a famous theatre, and it remained open for 42 years after he established it. So that's his early period. Middle period, he writes, his first kind of work in the middle period is In the Seven Woods, which is a poetry collection published in 1903, and there's a lot of kind of romantic notions of his earlier works are gone now, and we get kind of more of a sparse style and more realistic concerns. And this continues through works like 1910's The Green Helmet, which I can't hear without thinking of The Green Hornet, and reaches its apex in 1916's kind of aptly titled Easter 1916, which is a poem about a real failed Irish uprising against English rule. And here Yeats is in like full-on nationalist mode. He has put aside the fairies and the idealistic portraits of Ireland, and he's talking about serious business, war, violence, things like that. Another important work that has a title that does not sound nearly as, you know, warlike and violent is called The Wild Swans at Coole, but it's still a significant poem. That's in 1917. Later days, his most celebrated and kind of most maybe remembered poem these days is in 1920. And this actually remarks kind of a return to the more metaphysical days of his youth, but with an important twist. This is The Second Coming, and it's something you've probably heard a bit or a piece of it quoted at some point in your life, because it's got some pretty famous lines. Granddaddy of modernism. He's sort of like the progenitor of it all in a way. And he's sort of an older generation that many of the kind of more, you know, people we think more of as modernist poets, he was extremely influential to them. Like, he's older, again, kind of big granddaddy figure. Ezra Pound actually stayed with him for a few winters in a cottage in like southeast England. They're like hanging out, writing poetry, fighting over who left the dishes in the sink, you know, stuff like that. And this poem in particular, The Second Coming, is important not only as a work of modernist poetry, but also as a work that really directly comments on sort of the social condition post-World War I that spurred the development of modernist poetry. So it's kind of like twofold significant. It's published in 1920, which is kind of in the latter part of Yeats' career. He dies in 1939, so he's getting to be kind of an old dude by this point. Again, World War I lasted 1914 and 1918, kind of notable for being really unexpectedly violent and destructive, because like old methods of waging war, like trenches, were kind of combined with new technology, like better guns, that produced battles that really went nowhere and just killed everyone. As you might notice in the title, right, the Second Coming is kind of an overtly religious reference. You can't hear that term without thinking of the Second Coming of Christ. At least, and I'm a lifelong lapsed Episcopalian, and I still hear that. Maybe you don't, but that's what Yeats is going for, is sort of an immediate Jesus reference, essentially. So what's Yeats doing with this kind of religious language, right? And how does it relate to World War I? That's what we're going to kind of look into. First, we're just going to take a look at the poem. It's really short, and it seems kind of blasphemous, no pun intended, to split it into pieces. So we're going to just read the whole thing out. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the Second Coming is at hand. The Second Coming, hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. A waste of desert sand, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it wind shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Where to start? First of all, what is this widening gyre that Yeats kind of discusses in the opening line? Refers to Yeats's admittedly very weird philosophy of how history works. You never usually picture history like as a timeline. You might even sort of have one for yourself, right? Like mine begins at my birthday, kind of has hash marks at like graduation, when I got my car, when I first saw Lord of the Rings, and how like AD or CE for Common Era, right? That timeline begins at the birth of Jesus, year 0. Yeats has a much weirder model of the progression of history. Basically, he envisions it as two really big cone-shaped structures that are facing opposite ways in space, overlapping so that the nose of one rests in the center of the mouth of the other. So a gyre is a path, right, that you make if you travel on the cone in sort of a spiraling outward sort of way. So turning and turning on the widening gyre is the idea that as history progresses, we're going round and round, and the circling is getting wider and wider. And I can see you sitting there banging your head at the computer saying, why does this matter? It matters because Yeats had this idea that 1920, or post-World War I in general, was just about the time when they were transitioning from the outer gyre to the inner gyre. So you're about to kind of turn around and start going back the other way to the narrow point of the second one that's in the wide mouth of the first one. It's basically just a giant metaphor for stuff is changing. The character of the next age is going to be different than this past one. It's worth keeping in mind that every generation thinks the world is going to hell in a handbasket. Or, you've probably heard a ton of studies that prove that today's college students don't have any empathy and no attention span and all this stuff. And the internet is ruining the world, and we're all going to be robots. And people have thought the world was going to be ruined forever. So we're not the first. Yeats was not the first or the last. But the modernists writing at that time really thought that something big was happening post-World War I in terms of the character of the age, the character of the time. And the gyre model kind of implies, the way that it widens and then it kind of collapses in onto the point and goes the other way on the other cone, kind of implies that there's a certain amount of increasing chaos, right? Things get looser and looser until it kind of collapses back down. And so we get the next line, right? The falcon cannot hear the falconer. We realize that sort of technically that first description might have actually been describing the bird's path, right? This falcon flying in this widening circle. But the metaphor still works, right? The world is out of control. The falcon-falconer image kind of adds the sense that, right, communication is totally hampered by the widening of the gyre, right? The falconer's over here and the falcon's over here, and the falcon's totally going to get loose, right? Things are going to get away from us. Loose falcons flying everywhere. Crazy times, chaos, widening gyre. That's what that all means. Get to the next bit. We say, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. That really reinforces this. The gyre grows too wide to be sort of comprehended and confined, and there's no sense of where the center is anymore. If things fall apart sounds familiar, it's because it's the title of a famous book you may have had to read in school called Things Fall Apart. It's by a Nigerian author, Chinua Achebe. It kind of focuses on changes experienced by Igbo people as colonists and missionaries came into their world. So it's kind of used to signal a similar type of change that Yeats is getting at in his poem as well. And the repetition then we get of loosed in the next two lines, right? Mere anarchy is loosed and the blood-dimmed tide is loosed. Kind of furthers this idea that we're flinging things around, things are getting far apart and aren't bound together anymore. Also connotes the releasing a little bit, kind of connotes the releasing of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? They're loose onto the world, the chaos. That's described in Revelations, right? That book in the Bible that kind of describes the second coming. Again, laughs Episcopalian. I know this stuff, kind of. Any event, it's bad, right? The loosing is bad, clearly. And all these images, right, they're super violent and dark and warlike in a way, and that makes sense that it's in this World War I context. Also in the Revelations context, because stuff gets bad in that part of the Bible, I hear. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. This further emphasizes, right, that the world is on its head. There's a reversal going on, right? Maybe the people that we see as the best are kind of waffling around and don't know what to do, and the people we see as the worst have kind of gained momentum, right? They're the pointy bit on the end of the new gyre that's going that way. And, then at the beginning of the next stanza, we get to the title of the poem, right? Must be a good part. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly those words out when a vast image out of spiritus mundi troubles my sight. So he's saying that all of this kind of signals that something big must be coming, some revelation. And then he specifies that it's the second coming. But this seems to bother him, right? And that's that sort of Latin term, spiritus mundi, that comes in there. It's really it's Latin for the soul of the world. Yeats is using it to mean sort of a communal understanding of knowledge, kind of like that. And I told you we have all these kind of hocus pocus ideas about history and society and whatnot. This is just another one of them. So he's kind of saying that when he declares this revelation to be the second coming, he gets a troubling, vast image, seemingly from the soul of the world, the spiritus mundi, that troubles his sight, right? In the next few lines, he goes on to describe this vision. He describes a wasteland desert with this sort of sphinx-like creature living in it. And he says, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs while all about it wind shadows of the indignant desert birds. This is a really apocalyptic seeming vision, right? And we're also hearkening back to Egypt with the Sphinx and the desert birds, and it kind of is representing, right, a world that is very different from our current one. Also one that's in the past, and also pre-first coming of Jesus, which I think might be important as well. So we're kind of, emphasizing this kind of gyre two-way motion, right, that we might be going back to something that was before as we go forward. He goes on. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. And now we get real explicit references to the birth of Jesus, right? We get the city Bethlehem, we get the rocking cradle. But Jesus maybe isn't going to be born again, right? That's not Yeats's vision of what the second coming is going to look like. It's going to be some unfamiliar creature, right? Some rough beast that heralds the start of the new age. And it's such a good, what a way to describe it, right? Slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. It's such a sharp image, right? This shadowy, dark creature. It's not walking, it's slouching towards the birthplace of Jesus. It's kind of slinking along. And it's moving in a totally alien way. I think that's the importance there of slouching. It's not walking or running or doing anything we might recognize as a way that a creature moves. So that's the, and that's the poem, right? That's the end of the poem. And so what has Yeats really said, right? The world is changing. Galadriel voice, the world is changing. And because of the way change happens, right? We move from the widening outer gyre to the tip of the inner gyre that then goes back the other way. it seems chaotic and uncontrolled. Things seem to be falling apart. Certainly something must be coming along to fix it, right? Something that we might think is the second coming of Christ, because we have all this apocalyptic stuff happening, which is supposed to herald the second coming. But if we think the herald of the new age is going to be something familiar, we're sorely mistaken. That's what Yeats is saying. The future is going to look different because it is different, and it will seem menacing because it's different. It's utterly unfamiliar. So kind of despite its title, right, it's not really about the second coming of Christ. It's about sort of how apocalyptic it feels to live in a world in a state of flux. So why use the religious metaphor, right? Why does he do it? Trade secret here, I've been constructing these lessons to appeal to you by reading a book called Made to Stick, which is basically about how to structure an argument so it will stick and so that you will remember what I say. And one of the tactics that it uses that it advocates is to use a schema to help explain a point. A schema is basically just something that your audience is already familiar with that can be related to what you're trying to explain. So, like, let's say you already know how to dance, which might be a big assumption depending on the person. And then I tell you that learning how to drive a manual transmission car is a lot like dancing, right? You have to react to your current circumstances and perform a series of moves in response. I'm relying on your schema of dancing to teach you about driving. What's the benefit of using a schema? You can usually teach something much more efficiently and quickly than if you had to do it from scratch. Yeats is relying on the reader's schema of Christianity to communicate his anxiety about the unfamiliar world. All that bad stuff, right, that he's describing in the first stanza, things falling apart, all of that stuff, it sounds a lot like what's supposed to happen before the second coming, as sort of described in Revelations. So the next stanza, right, he references that schema, he calls it up, he says explicitly second coming. But even in his introduction, right, he already kind of reveals he might be going to undermine this point later on. You know, the surely the second coming is at hand seems a bit sort of disingenuous, right? Maybe it's not so surely that the second coming is at hand. So we might be expecting something positive to be coming, but Yeats, he undermines that. He shows us instead that something weird is coming, something potentially devastating is coming. So using this kind of model of Christianity, the schema, he sets up this expectation and then violates it, showing us where the situation he's describing differs from the one that you might be familiar with from the Bible and from Christianity. And this kind of takes us on a greater sort of journey of discovery with him, and it cements his message more firmly in our heads than if he had just said, things are different and weird, which would not be poetry. Because really, if you think about it, right, communicating sharply, efficiently, and poignantly, right, by using images like these wheeling birds, the slouching towards Bethlehem, schemas like the second coming, it's kind of what makes poetry poetry, right? I could just write something, but if I make it into a poem, I'm doing things that are going to be more efficient, because poems are short, they don't have a lot of space. I'm trying to make every word count. And Yeats's kind of command of this is really what makes him a great poet, and what makes the second coming. And around this time, Ireland gets its freedom. Right? Remember, I mentioned that was in 1922. And Yeats starts taking on his political roles, although he continues to write during this time. He writes some nonfiction. He knocks out this spiritual thing called The Vision, which elaborates a little bit on all that gyre stuff. He writes plays. He writes one called The Resurrection. And of course, he writes more poems. Collections sort of post-Irish freedom are 1928's The Tower and 1933's The Winding Stair and other poems. Still, none of this is remembered in the same way the Second Coming is. It's still important, but it's kind of maybe, the Second Coming is probably one of his more talked about poems today. Yeats passes away in 1939. He's 73, so he lived to a ripe old age. And his poetic legacy really encompasses, strong nationalism, kind of a rich literary culture. He sort of brings in Irish stuff into his works, and he writes a lot. He writes metaphysically, he writes realistically, he writes fantastically, and he's remembered. He's remembered for first saying that things fall apart, the center cannot hold, which is something that we quote incessantly. But he's also really a forerunner of modernism and just a prolific guy. So W.B. Yeats, prolific guy and forerunner of modernism.
Wallace Stevens was a modernist poet who incorporated many styles into his poems. Modernist poets did away with the traditional form of poetry, instead preferring to use simple language and break from traditional rhyme and meter. Most of the modernist poets wrote for ordinary people. That's why they preferred to use simple language. They wanted to make poetry more accessible for everyone, not just for the people who had gone to expensive, exclusive colleges. But Wallace Stevens was different. He wanted to challenge his readers, and often wrote poetry that was specifically geared towards people who were college-educated and familiar with forms and ideas that he used. In other words, his poetry can be a bit harder to understand. Let's look at Stevens' most famous poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, and then we'll examine 3 ways to interpret the poem. 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. 1. Among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of the blackbird. 2. I was of 3 minds, like a tree in which there are 3 blackbirds. 3. The blackbird whirled in the autumn winds. It was a small part of the pantomime. 4. A man and a woman are one. A man and a woman and a blackbird are one. 5. I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling or just after. 6. Icicles filled the long window with barbaric glass. The shadow of the blackbird crossed it to and fro. The mood traced in the shadow an indecipherable cause. 7. O thin men of Haddam, why do you imagine golden birds? Do you not see how the blackbird walks around the feet of the women about you? 8. I know noble accents and lucid, inescapable rhythms, but I know, too, that the blackbird is involved in what I know. 9. When the blackbird flew out of sight, it marked the edge of one of many circles. 10. At the sight of blackbirds flying in a green light, even the bawds of euphony would cry out sharply. 11. He rode over Connecticut in a glass coach. Once, a fear pierced him in that he mistook the shadow of his equipage for blackbirds. 12. The river is moving. The blackbird must be flying. 13. It was evening all afternoon. It was snowing, and it was going to snow. The blackbird sat in the cedar limbs. Did you notice how each of the 13 ways is divided into its own short, simple stanza? Each one could be kind of seen as its own little poem. Many people have pointed out the way the stanzas of this poem are similar to haikus. A haiku is a short Japanese poem, generally with 3 short lines for a total of 17 syllables. Stevens might have been influenced by haikus when he wrote the stanzas. Though none of the stanzas are haikus in the strictest sense, many of them are sparse like haikus are. Look at the first and second stanzas again. 1. Among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of the blackbird. 2. I was of 3 minds, like a tree in which there are 3 blackbirds. You'll notice that each of these has very few words. In fact, they have just enough words to offer the barest outline of an image or an idea, but not enough for the reader to fully see what Stevens is describing. There's a lot left to the imagination, which is very common in haiku verse. This poem also has a lot in common with imagism. Imagism is a poetry movement where the most important thing is to describe something, very simply and with no extraneous words. This poem is full of simple descriptions of things. Consider the 12th stanza. The river is moving. The blackbird must be flying. This stanza by itself could be an imagist poem. It simply describes something and lets the reader decide what the image means, if anything. Besides imagism, though, there are many other ways to interpret this poem. One of them has to do with a school of philosophy called perspectivism. According to perspectivism, nothing exists outside of our perspective or interpretation of it. A desk is not a desk. It is only a desk because we perceive it to be a desk. In this way, perspectivism is a philosophy that our perspective of things is what gives them meaning. Look again at stanza 9. When the blackbird flew out of sight, it marked the edge of one of many circles. In this stanza, the view of the blackbird flying out of sight gives the narrator, and the reader, a particular perspective on the blackbird. Think about how that perspective might be different if the blackbird was flying towards the narrator instead of away. Many people view 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird as a perspectivist poem. That is, the poem is about all the different ways we can view a blackbird. Each stanza is a different perspective on the blackbird, and each stanza has its own meaning. The stanzas can be read on their own as if they were 13 mini-poems. Because they are self-contained like this, Stevens is pointing out that each perspective is itself as important as the blackbird. In fact, you could say that the blackbird in the poem doesn't exist outside of the perspectives, and therefore is a different bird in each stanza.